All right, welcome back, grade 9. So today we're looking at chapter 3. And I want to look ahead a little bit to our evaluation that we're going to have on Friday. And today's Wednesday, so we have tomorrow and today to wrap up this chapter. And one of the things we started yesterday was a look at the concept of reasonable limits to rights. So I'd like to revisit that, as it will be the focus of the written part of the evaluation on Friday. Yesterday, we also looked at the definition of human rights, and we looked at the content of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that will be part of the multiple choice that you see on Friday. So on Friday, you'll get two parts of the evaluation. One part will look at multiple choice, and one part will be written response. And the multiple choice is based on yesterday's topic of the concept of human rights, the evolution of human rights, and the content of human rights within the document of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the written response is about reasonable limits. And we talked about that yesterday. I'd like to continue it today. So you may want to take some notes, because what we're talking about right now is the second half of that evaluation on Friday. So you may remember that yesterday we looked at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and we found out that it was created in 1982, and it really defines the relationship between Canada's government and those of us who are governed. That the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is part of the Constitution, and that's the ultimate law of the land. So it really defines how much freedom and how much security we have. And right in the first part of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there's a section that states that the government can reasonably limit the rights that they're about to list. So they're about to give this nice little list of rights, and then they're like, you know what? Before we get into all of the rights that you have, we can reasonably limit them. So yesterday we talked about reasonable limits. Yesterday we talked about how the freedom of speech may be limited because you're at war, and they don't want our soldiers at war to be engaged in any conversations that may be dangerous to the operation. That may include limiting your footprint on social media, because they don't want you to leak information about upcoming operations. In history, before social media, there were things called letters, and people would write letters home from the battlefront. And sometimes these letters would be transported by boat, and the boats would be targeted by U-boats, by submarines, to be sunk in World War II. And what were they looking for? They were looking for those letters because sometimes soldiers would be careless, and they might talk about their planning for future operations. But most of those letters home would have been edited. They would have been screened and censored, and a lot of things would be blacked out if they were mentioning upcoming things. So typically you have the freedom of speech, but during a time of crisis like war, there's things you can't say that might compromise group objectives. You have the freedom of speech, but you can't go to a crowded theater. Well, we can't go to crowded theaters right now regardless, but you can't go to a crowded theater and scream fire, because you may cause panic. So that's another example of limiting power. Limiting your rights. So we have a list here, a list of sources. On Friday, you're meant to use the following sources to gather information and then explore the concept of reasonable rights. So there's a list of sources. It's like doing some research, and then you get to write about the concept of reasonably limiting rights. And I think today, in 2020, this is a very relevant topic. You see in the United States, you see in Canada, you see a lot of protest, you see a lot of people talking about social justice and the need to have a redefinition of our relationship with our government. So here's some historical stuff I'd like you to look at. So the first one is about the FLQ crisis. So over the next day and a half, we're going to visit 1970 Canada, and we're going to look at the FLQ crisis. In the fall of 1970, a radical separatist group in Quebec, the FLQ, kidnapped two prominent individuals, a British diplomat, and a member of the Quebec government. The FLQ referred to the captives as political prisoners and set a series of conditions for their release. Tensions rose in Quebec, and at one mass rally, the crowd began chanting FLQ, FLQ, in support of the radicals. The federal government chose to respond to the crisis by invoking the War Measures Act. The act gave the police across Canada extraordinary powers, including the right to search homes, seize property without needing a search warrant. Furthermore, the police held the power to detain individuals up to 90 days without the need to indicate the charges for which the person was being held. So you're not under arrest, but we're just going to keep you here for 90 days. To assist the police in their actions, units of the Canadian Army were put on the streets in Montreal and in Ottawa. So typically, in Canada, we have rights. But you can see that during a time of crisis, these rights are being taken away. So what is the crisis? Well, the crisis here is that you have two prominent individuals kidnapped. You have a group of radicals wanting to create a separatist French state in Quebec. They're trying to use extortion. They're trying to use terrorism to convince Canada to let Quebec go, to become separate. So it's not ordinary times, these are extraordinary times. These are different times. And the government under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau said that we need extraordinary powers to deal with this threat. This isn't just a normal threat. We're talking about a grave threat to the future of Canada. So they invoked the War Measures Act that gave the Canadian military and police extraordinary power. Looking at that section, you should be able to see individual sections of the charter that would be limited. Just got to fix my mask here. Even though the charter didn't exist until 1982, and this is an incident from 1970, we can still apply the same types of rights here. So we're talking about mobility rights. Are we talking about equality rights? Are we talking about democratic rights? Are we talking about what type of rights are being taken away from people within the source? So on Friday, you're going to need to be able to look at that source and identify which category of rights is being taken away and how is it justified. How does the government say, you know what, normally you have legal rights. You have the right to a trial. You have the right to know why you're being detained. But today, we're just going to detain you for 90 days. You have no legal rights. Your legal rights are suspended. And they're saying it's justified here because we are under attack of terrorism. That because of terrorism, your individual rights are being limited because something's more important. And that something is collective security, the common good. So at the beginning of this course, we started with a look at individualism versus collectivism. Locke and Hobbes is coming back here. Now, Hobbes would suggest that the people need to fear the government. Otherwise, we live in the state of nature where it's lawlessness, and life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So we have the FLQ behaving like they're in a state of nature, using might, using force and intimidation to get their way. But Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, he wants to see democracy define Canada, not some kind of social Darwinism or survival of the fittest. So he's going to invoke the War Measures Act. Ironically, he's going to take away liberty to save liberty. And he justifies it because he's suggesting that the activities of the FLQ are so grave that if the government doesn't respond like this, we will see more kidnapped, more killed, and potentially we may lose Quebec. Here's another example. Another case study you'll see on Friday. Reasonable limits. When is it, or is it ever reasonable for a province to say, you know what, we don't want you having kids. We don't want any more like you. You are having a child is a natural thing, right? Talk about natural rights. What's more natural than being a mother? But the province of Alberta, the one that we live in Alberta, beginning in the early 1900s, many people campaigned for the passage of legislation that would require mental health testing before the provision of marriage license. Influenced by international eugenics movement, backed by genetic theory at the time, promoted by influential citizens, and fueled by racist sentiments, these initial calls for mental health testing soon became demands for sterilization. So, firstly, some people shouldn't get married because we don't want them to have kids. And then, you know what? Some people are still having kids. Well, let's sterilize them then. If we can't stop them from having kids by stopping them from marrying, let's stop them from having kids by sterilizing them. And I mentioned in the past already that there's many cases in Canada, in Alberta, in this region, a girl from Lacombe that was sterilized in Red Deer, Lulani Mir, against her knowledge. She didn't know what was happening. The surgery, the point of the surgery was kept a secret. So next time that you think that, the government is, somebody says, hey, take off your hat, and you're like, oh man, it's my right to wear a hat. Her uterus was taken away. She could never have a child. She thought she was going in for a different surgery. I think it was like they suggested it was her, appendix or something that they're removing. And they went in, they took the uterus because they said, you know what, you scored low on an IQ test. We don't want you to have kids. She scored low on an IQ test because she was undernourished. She scored low on an IQ test because she was a ward of the state and she didn't have, a home that would support her academic growth. So that's just one case of somebody being sterilized. So on Friday, I want you to talk about that idea of sterilization. Should the state be able to say to some people, you know what? If we have nearly 8 billion people on the planet, if we want mankind to evolve and progress, we don't need you to have kids. Your kids are going to be genetically like you. We don't need more of you. You're a burden on society. Do you think the state should do that? Maybe it's not reasonable. So some of these should inspire you to say, yeah, no, that shouldn't be done. You shouldn't be looking at all of these and saying, yeah, these are all reasonable. In April 30th, 2009, the European Union's 27 health ministers held an emergency meeting in Luxembourg to coordinate national measures to prevent the spread of H1N1 influenza virus. France pushed to suspend all European Union flights to Mexico, where thousands of infections have been confirmed. So, it's not 2009, it's 2020. We know what pandemics are like. During a pandemic, is it acceptable, is it reasonable to say, you know what, we're closing our borders? If there's an outbreak right now in fill-in-the-blank country, fill-in-the-blank city, so remember back in April when there's hundreds of thousands of cases in New York City, is it reasonable for the government of Canada to say to Canadians, no Canadians get to travel to New York right now? Is that a reasonable limit to your mobility right? So on Friday, I want you to be able to identify, okay, this is our mobility right, the freedom of movement. But during extraordinary circumstances, like a pandemic, it might say, you know what, you can't move. Even here, even now, even in Wetaskiwin, if you have a positive test and you're currently infected with the virus or the virus COVID-19, they may say to you, you're under quarantine, you need to stay home. You shouldn't go and hang out at the skateboard park or go vape with your buddies in the parking lot. No, you're sick. You go vape with your buddies and you pass a vape around, no, they're sick. So normally you have the mobility rights. You have the freedom of assembly. But during a pandemic, the government may have to act as a parent. And as their parent, they may say, you know what, you're not making sound decisions, we're going to make them for you. They're staying home. They're staying home. Same thing with the University of Western Ontario in reaction to H1N1 in 2009. They said, okay, nobody from our university is going to Mexico. Staying home. So, Here's another quote though. Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants, it is the creed of slaves. So that's short, but it's saying, whoa, all these ones up here are saying, well, it's necessary for me to take your freedom away. This person's like, you know what? That's what Hitler said. That's what Stalin said. That's what tyrants say. That's how they justify taking your freedom away, is saying, oh, it's necessary. So I know a guy named George Birdie, and George Birdie formed a band called RAHOWA in 1989. And RAHOWA stands for Racial Holy War. And long story short, George Birdie was an Italian Catholic student that lived in Little Italy in Toronto. But by the time he was in grade 12, his Little Italy wasn't so Italian anymore. So he's getting very concerned about his culture being lost. He was asked to do some presentations at school. He was a very academic student, and he wanted to get more information, so he did some research, and he went and he decided, well, I need to talk to people that are connected to the topic he was researching. So he's like, I need to go find some skinheads. Where can I find skinheads? So he said, well, they like to wear Doc Marten boots. He went to where they sell Doc Marten boots. I said this was going to be a short story. It seems like it's the long version. Anyways, he ended up meeting some of them. He had a barbecue. They became friends. He decided that in order to spread the word, he needed to use a means that people would listen to, like music. So he created a band called RAHOWA, Racial Holy War, and he made a lot of songs, but his concerts were controversial. The police would have to come and protect the band and his fans because there'd be people protesting his music, because his music is full of lyrics that promote the white race at the expense of others. And some people would say, you know what, buddy? You have the freedom of speech, but you don't have the freedom to speak hatred. Even if the people you're speaking to have all bought tickets and they've decided to come to your concert, there's things you can't say at your concert. So George Birdie joined a group called the Heritage Front. He goes to Ottawa, he makes a speech at the foot of Parliament Hill. There's some people that are protesting against him. They get in a fight. He stomps somebody's head. He goes to jail. When in jail, he's in prison with his fellow skinheads, and he realizes, hey, these skinheads, there's not really a lot to them. They're just racist. They're really flat characters. And I'd like to be more than that. So he ends up distancing himself from the front, and when he gets out, he decides he needs to go on his own way. So as a lone wolf, he goes to the gym, he works out by himself, and then a guy starts befriending him, says, hey, do you need a hand? You're lifting a lot of weight there. You need somebody to spot you when you're bench pressing. And then his friend's like, after when they're getting changed, he's like, hey, why do you got that swastika on your chest? That's a sign of hatred. And George is like, oh, I just like the symbol. Trying to hide the fact that he used to be a part of, this white supremacist group, the Heritage Front. So he and his buddy end up going bar hopping one night. They can't get into the bar they wanted, so they go to a different bar. He sees this goddess from across the room. He falls in love with her. He marries her. He thinks she's Italian. She ends up being Indian. She's from India. His new friend from the gym is Jewish, and he's got this big swastika on his chest. George is a character who's changed. But at a time in his history, there was a moment when George was just spewing hatred. And perhaps during that time, the government should have said, you can't say that. You're censored. Pierre Trudeau was asked about homosexuality back in the 60s. Should homosexuality be legislated against? Can we allow this kind of activity? And his response, there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. What's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code. It's not illegal in Canada to be gay. This is at a time in 1967 when it was illegal in many countries to be gay. So Pierre Trudeau is saying it's not reasonable to police someone's sexuality or gender. And he said that, Pierre Trudeau, more than 50 years ago. He's very progressive. During World War II, the Canadian government decided, we're at war with Japan. We have a lot of Japanese living in Canada. They could potentially join our enemy and invade us. Maybe it's reasonable for us to take 20,000 Canadians that are Japanese descent and move them away from the Vancouver coast. Is it reasonable to take their homes, to relocate them because we're at war with the Japanese? So, ladies and gentlemen, on Friday, you're going to have all of these things printed out for you, and I want you to combine them into some kind of discussion about reasonable limits of freedom. But you can't have that discussion if you have no idea what your rights are, mobility rights, democratic rights, and all of those things. And that's really your first step. And speaking of the first step, when you go to this evaluation document, this evaluation we're having on Friday, if you go up through those multiple choice, what are the multiple choice questions about? It's about your rights. It's basically going to show you cartoons or quotes and say, hey, what's happening here? Are we talking about fundamental freedoms, democratic rights, mobility rights, equality rights, or legal rights? So when we get back from the break, maybe make sure you know the difference between those 5 things. Go out the front doors, it's break time.